some kind of semi-divine being, comes down, flattens the fences around the house, and then we are told, hākinakina, with Orona's wife. And this is translated as this person, this entity, comes and sports with his wife. So it goes in the dictionary as sport. But never mind, now hākinakina is the word for sport. Fine, absolutely fine.
My guest today is Dr. Ray Harlow. Ray was a former professor of linguistics at the University of Waikato, where he's now an honorary fellow. He's a noted scholar in Te Reo Māori with over 40 years of study in the language. He's taught at Otago and Waikato universities. He's an author of over a dozen books, including, but not limited to, Māori, A Linguistic Introduction and A Māori Reference Grammar, the latter of which is a distillation, an expansion of a third-year paper which he taught here at the University of Waikato for several years. Ray was a founding member of the Māori Language Commission, which was established in 1987. He was also involved in setting up Te Kohanga Reo o Ngā Kuaka, which is adjacent to the university. He has a Master of Arts degree in Greek from Otago University, where he would later teach linguistics and one course in Māori language studies. And while he was studying in Zurich, he also wrote his doctoral thesis in German. Ray is also a musician, organist and chorister. He's been involved in singing in choirs for many years in Hamilton. Ray, it's a pleasure to speak with you today.
Thanks for the invitation, Fergus.
So I want to get into some of your work in te reo space, but just almost by way of introduction, what were the sort of circumstances which led to you studying te reo Māori? Because coming from studying Greek...
Right, a bit odd in a way. As Fergus said, I did a doctorate at Zurich University, and I got appointed then to a lectureship in classics at Otago in 1971, that was. But after a few years, for a variety of reasons, I felt that I needed to go back to Europe for a while. And so and enjoying British citizenship, which meant that no work permits were required in places like Germany. I moved to Munich, where I taught in a high school. I taught English, Latin and a bit of Greek at a German high school. And I found I had an awful lot of spare time. And it seemed to me a waste just to spend this spare time in the beer gardens or beer halls, which would have been very easy to do. So the question which arose for me is, now what do I spend all this time and so on? By this time, I'd either studied or become at least slightly familiar with quite a lot of the languages which form part of what's called the Indo-European language family. Despite their superficial differences, they actually all work in very similar kind of way. So I thought it was time to try and explore what some other language families looked like. I'd already done some Chinese when I was in Zurich, so I had a smattering of that, which of course has disappeared entirely again by now. But as a New Zealander, I thought that, well, Māori and the Polynesian languages is a perfectly good language family just lying there, waiting for me to look at and get familiar with. So while living still in Munich and having, as I say, quite a lot of spare time, I began to teach myself some Māori by means of some books I had sent from friends, but also from resources within the university library in Munich, which is very good indeed, very, very big library. So I did this for quite some time, and I was constantly in touch with one of my teachers back at Otago, who was herself very interested in aspects of Māori literature. And out of the blue, she managed to organise for me a postdoc fellowship, which was that I should continue in Munich for a further year, doing what I was doing. I was then to move to Auckland and spend a year with the Māori studies people there, particularly Bruce Bigg and his colleagues. And if at the end of that, the University of Otago offered me a position, I was bound to take it. Now, this was already starting to be the time where if people offered you jobs like this, you didn't actually think long and hard about it. The backstory here was that Otago had been trying for quite some time to make an appointment to teach Māori language, quite unsuccessfully, and I think they took quite a big leap here, quite a big risk in a way in making this scheme available to me. And in fact, this got put in the press as Otago University appoints somebody who's been sent to Germany in order to learn Māori, was actually how they said it. There were questions in the house and things like that. And
you're in Hansard.
Quite a lot of suspicion, actually. But things settled down, and I was asked then, eventually after a year or so at Otago, where I was then teaching linguistics, to offer a course in Māori, and I said yes, I would do that on two conditions. The first condition was that the university would continue looking for a proper appointment in Māori, and the second condition was that the people at the local marae in Otago, in Dunedin, which was Otako, out at the end of the of the Otago Peninsula, approved of my doing so. So I took my take out there at a hui, and I was supported in my application by Sir Tipene O'Regan, and the locals were very happy for me to teach this one course with the same condition that I'd already put on the university, that they would like eventually there to be a full appointment. And after about 3 years there was. So I taught a single course in Māori for 3 years. About the same time, or a bit after, I was made a member of the Māori Language Commission, and in 1990 moved to Waikato. And I attribute what fluency I now have in Māori to, in fact, three things, all of which were pretty much jumping off the deep end into a pool. The first was that when you're teaching a language, standing up in the front of a class and being required on the spot to construct model sentences, dialogues, role-playing and that sort of thing. This really sharpens your mind in coming to that language. Yeah. The second thing was the being appointed to the Māori Language Commission. Timo Tikaritu, who was the commissioner, our first commissioner, said at our first meeting, well, we can't expect anybody else to conduct their business in Māori unless we do. So from now on, no English whatsoever. So all the business of the commission, all the socialising that we did amongst ourselves when we were staying in Wellington and so on, that, from that point on was Māori. And the third thing was moving here to Waikato, because Timo Tikaritu had firmly put a stamp on the nature of the department here, and Māori was here, the default language for pretty much every activity. And I mean absolutely every activity, not just classes, not just department meetings, but all socialising parties, casual conversation, absolutely everything. And so these three experiences I'm really grateful for, and they've a major contribution to what fluency I might have.
Yeah. So it's interesting you mentioned your sort of linguistic sipuna in a way when it comes to Te Reo Māori. You mentioned Bruce Biggs. Would you consider him a mentor, teacher?
Yeah, pretty much, certainly teacher. And my own work on Māori grammar, which was based largely around a third-year course that I taught for some years as part of the department, is based on the model of Māori grammar that Bruce used. So to at least to that extent. Also for his personal encouragement in the years I knew him. He was very encouraging about my being involved in this area of study.
Yeah. It seems, I'm picking up some threads from what you've said so far. It seems to be that in terms of acquiring language, immersion is an important aspect, but also the personal support from people, you feeling like there are people who are supporting you and have your back and are able to carry you through the...
Yeah, I think they're certainly helpful. I'd go further though and say, while you mentioned immersion, it may be that adults, like children, can actually acquire a language simply through immersion, through being placed where they have to hear it and respond. But children do this in a way which is so marvellous that it's a real puzzle to linguists how children can acquire language so quickly, so effortlessly, and so on. Adults can't. So I've always felt that adults need not only an environment which reinforces what they're learning, but they actually do need conscious learning. Conscious acquisition of grammar and vocabulary and idiom to get anything like a decent knowledge of the language.
What are some of the challenges in terms of studying Te Reo Māori from a linguistics point of view? You know, from an English point of view, I would sort of think of it as, we have things, those physical objects, they have names and those are nouns. Those physical objects have characteristics, those are adjectives. We can do things, those things are verbs.
Yep.
How well does Te Reo Māori fit into that?
Right, yeah, the story of the parts of speech of Māori is quite an interesting one. Early attempts to describe the language in, say, the 19th century took a very Latinate approach to the language, to the extent that you even got what are called declensions of nouns. Latin, as you probably know, changes the endings on nouns in order to reflect what the function of the noun is in a sentence, whether it's the subject, the object, or whatever it might be. 6 different cases. And some early grammars of Māori actually did this. They would set out, a list so they would take a noun, like say whare, for instance, and then they would say, this is its objective case, that's its possessive case, and so on. But of course, it's always just these prepositions like e, ki, or, more, and so on that determine that. So to talk in those terms really is nonsense in the case of Māori.
Right.
But quite apart from that, the actual parts of speech themselves, the early attempts also tried to put Māori into the traditional, again, Latinate sets of parts of speech, which work quite well for English, incidentally. This is not always a given, but the Latin ones and the English ones seem to work relatively well. Don't work at all well for Māori. And Bruce Biggs, one of the great leaps forward that Bruce made in terms of studying the language, was to propose a completely different way of classifying the words of Māori. He distinguished between 2 classes of words: particles, which carry largely the weight of the grammatical structure and the information about the roles, about tense, about the roles of nouns and so on the one hand, and content words, which he called bases, on the other. And these are all your other words, as that you referred to before, what we would otherwise call verbs, adjectives, nouns.
Right.
But within these bases, he distinguished in a number of classes on quite different criteria from what had been used before. This was further extended by Pat Hohepa, and that's the scheme. Essentially, Bruce Hohepa's scheme is the one that I use in the grammar. However, the pull back to nouns and verbs and that sort of thing has really been quite strong, to the extent that the Māori monolingual dictionary now uses essentially
He pātaka kupu
essentially has gone back essentially to the nouns, verbs. An important thing about Māori is that if you put a base as the head of its phrase, that is to say the idea, be it a thing or an action or a quality or something like that, that the phrase is about, any base at all that follows it can modify that. So you do get expressions like te whare nui, okay, meaning the big house,
the house
being
big.
the head, and nui following. Modifiers follow pretty much universally in Māori. This sort of construction leads people to say, aha, whare is a noun, nui is an adjective. But it turns out that nui can also be used as a verb. Ka nui nā kōrero, that's enough talk. Ka nui tera. As a verb, okay?
Yeah.
But it also can be used as a noun. Te nui.
Yes, that was the example I was thinking of.
Yeah. So what is it? Is it an adjective, or is it in fact a noun? Is it a verb?
Yeah.
Early dictionaries and early grammars would say it was all 3. And this led, of course, to huge numbers of words in the dictionary having many parts of speech, which seemed to Bruce to be ridiculous.
Right.
And me too, for that matter. So what's perhaps a little confusing is that, say, a book like mine, I use verb as a class with subclasses. I use adjectives to describe a certain set of words for which there are particular grammatical criteria. And I use nouns. So it looks as though it's the same system, but in fact it depends on how these are used within Māori structures, rather than simply they translate English
It
nouns.
is intrinsically a noun or intrinsically a verb or...
Yes. What I would like to say, for instance, is that words like nui meaning big, pai meaning good, roa, long, a variety of words like I call them adjective, but I just define the word, or I describe the class of nouns, of words as adjectives, which can be used in certain ways. And that's what defines them. Not that they modify nouns, although that is one of the functions, but that there are these roles that these can play. Not all words in the language can be put in the same places as a word like nui, for instance. They therefore belong to another class.
Right.
There's also the other one too that we're used from English and again from Latin and lots of European languages. We're used to the notion of tense, having present, past, future, even perfect and that sort of thing. In Māori, there are words being used in a verb phrase, which would then indicate something like an activity or a state, can be accompanied by certain particles which look rather like tense. In fact, one is pure tense, and that's e, which is past. But the other ones express not tense, but other aspects of an activity. So something might be ongoing as opposed to complete. Something might be over as opposed to still occurring.
So ongoing would be e ana,
Yeah.
and complete would be kua. Is that?
Well, kua is a bit of a strange one. Mostly it does mean that, yes.
Yeah.
Something is completed.
Yeah.
Action, whatever is designated is completed or will be completed.
Right.
So it's not bound to time.
Yeah.
E is the only one which is bound to actually to time.
Yeah, I remember being shocked when I was studying Te Reo Māori at the very beginning, and they said, e is past, kua is past perfect, kei te, e ana, present tense, ka, future tense, and then I started seeing all these uses which did not fit that.
Yeah, that's right. As a kind of approximation, and possibly even as a default meaning for some of these things, that works quite well. But then, as you say, you quickly find out that e ana gets used for past circumstances or future circumstances, not just the present time.
So I want to ask you about some of the ways in which Te Reo Māori has changed over time.
Oh yeah.
And the way that I sort of thought about framing this question was, if we were to take a Māori speaker from today and take them back in a time machine to the 19th century or something like that, and got them to try and converse with someone, where would you anticipate the sort of stumbling blocks in their communication being?
Okay.
Today's episode is sponsored by Bro and Bro. Bro and Bro is a charity founded by Yin now, and Yin has also written this book here, One Stone, Two Birds. It's a book of 168 humorous cartoons featuring everyone's favourite average Kiwi characters, Pukeko and Tui. And so I thought it might be fun if we just open it up to a random page and have a look at what Yin has prepared for us.
When I drink coffee, I can't sleep, bro. I'm just the opposite, bro. When I sleep, I can't drink coffee.
So, if that's a bit of you, head over to brobro.nz to find out more and to see what other goodies Yin has for us over there. So thanks again to Yin and the team at Bro and Bro for sponsoring today's podcast.
That's quite interesting for two reasons. The Bible Society right this year, in fact it's actually happening right now, is publishing a little booklet. That little booklet contains the first published translations of parts of the scripture, 1827. Things like the Lord's Prayer, the Beatitudes, that's chapter 5 of Matthew, Ten Commandments.
The big ones.
Yeah. I mean, the things that the missionaries thought that people should know. And they're being put side by side with a modern translation, which is being produced as part of a project ongoing right now, whose ultimate goal is to produce a new, from scratch, translation of the Bible into Māori. When I say from scratch, I'm referring here to the fact that all the translations, all the complete Māori Bibles that there have been so far have been a first production and then successive revisions of that text. Whereas what's intended at the moment is that one starts actually again, doesn't look at any at the translations of the past, but looks at sources.
Yes.
Ideally, the Hebrew and the Greek.
Right.
Or using some kind of triangulation method with a number of English translations, so you can sort of see, right, this one tends that way, this one tends that way. What are they trying to reflect from the original to produce a new translation?
Right.
Enough of this has been produced that the passages that parallel the 1826 version are available, and so that's being put out. This will give people a chance to actually to see on paper what the languages looked at like at these two different stages. And my guess is that with regard to those texts, they all look very recognisably the same language.
Yeah.
People today would have very little difficulty, I think, in reading the 1827 ones. That's one reason. The other reason is, for quite some time now, I've been involved with a team of others from Auckland and Canterbury in a project looking at changes in pronunciation between the 19th century and now. The source material here is a collection of tapes made in the 1940s of people who were born in the latter half of the 19th century, 1880s roughly, and we're lucky enough to have them speaking both languages. We've supplemented this by making our own recordings of kaumātua alive in recent decades that we knew personally or that we could get contact with, and then younger people. So we had sort of a two-generation gap. We had modern young people, their grandparents, and then their grandparents. And what we've been doing largely is tracing shifts in pronunciation, and I'll come back to that. But it's been possible also to look at some of the little details of grammar and simply to listen to what these people in the old recordings were talking about. And the recordings that we have from the very early group, recorded in the 40s, born in the 1880s and so on, are entirely intelligible to people nowadays. There may be little bits of vocabulary which have gone out of use, but you look them up in Williams.
Yes.
It's all there. There are some perceptible shifts in grammar over that period. The main difference, however, is in pronunciation, particularly in the vowels, and to some degree also in this what's called WH sound, which I don't want to go into. But,
it's a whole can of worms.
there's been a shift there. Also the degree of what's called aspiration. People are now more inclined to say ta, whereas the older generation would have said ta.
Yes.
That's as a generalisation, that's increased over this period. Going the other direction, would somebody going back from now, particularly a younger person going back from now to the 19th century, would they be understood? In large part not, because there's been a huge amount of new vocabulary come into the language, some of it deliberately introduced to replace existing vocabulary. One still hears complaints even now of older people who don't understand, say, the television, they don't understand what the young are saying. So this would be even more the case if we were comparing the 19th century Māori with the young ones of today. This is partly pronunciation. I must just tell you, some colleagues in Hawaii who work in Hawaiian language, much the same way as Māori studies people do here work with Māori, have said Māori, when they've heard Māori spoken, it always sounds as though it sounds like Hawaiian only spoken with a New Zealand English accent.
Right.
Which is quite, odd thing to say, but it's quite true.
It's particularly the vowels.
But also the inflection, the way people speak, the intonation. And some people are quite marked now in the way they speak Māori that it just sounds so much like a New Zealand English intonation.
Yes, yeah.
I don't know how far that would have interfered with communication, but it would have really sounded odd to 19th century people, I'm sure.
Mm.
So I think overall, though, apart from vocabulary differences, the language is still very similar. Somewhere I've recently compared it to saying that 19th century Māori versus modern Māori would think of it in terms of Jane Austen English and modern English.
Right.
It's
understandable,
it's a feel. It's understandable. You can.
But you wouldn't speak like that.
No, but you wouldn't quite say it that way.
Yeah. I want to ask you about a paper which you wrote a few years ago, Covert Attitudes to Māori.
Yes.
And this was a set of a summary discussion of implicit attitudes which you had noticed in people's
which I
thinking.
believed I'd noticed, yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. Explicit attitudes to Māori are easy to measure. You ask people what they think.
Yes.
So people say they're in favour of it, or they're not in favour of it, or should be in the schools, or shouldn't be in the schools, whatever it might be. But it seemed to me too that there are clues around that suggested to me that people actually have attitudes to Māori, if you like, which they would not necessarily want to assent to, but which guide the way they react in certain ways. The paper was an attempt to sort of formulate something which had bothered me quite a bit, and I may be unpopular in some of these attitudes, but I just wanted to stick it out there and see what people felt. And by and large, those people who have read it said, yeah, that's kind of right, that makes sort of sense. Now, just to quote one of these things here, and that is place names.
Yes.
And this is current at the moment, as you know, because there's a petition going around and I think it says something like this, to make Aotearoa the name of New Zealand.
Official name, yeah.
The official name of New Zealand. Okay. Well,
what does that mean?
what I'm guessing is what they mean by this is they want Aotearoa to be made the official name in English for this country.
Right.
Aotearoa is the common name in Māori already.
Yes.
You know, it is, however, not the case, I believe, that it's officially the name in Māori.
Yes.
I wondered about this at one point, so I looked up the only piece of legislation that I know of which was enacted, in other words, is equally valid in both languages. There may be others, but one that I know of which this is true, is the Māori Language Act. So I thought, let's see how the Māori Language Act names this country in its Māori text.
Yes.
And that's New Tirini.
Right.
So there is a case to be made for making Aotearoa the official name in Māori, because it's what everybody says.
Yes.
If you want to make it an official name when using English too, that's all right. If you want to do that, that's fine. But I'm not quite sure what that contributes to the health of the Māori language.
Yes.
And because it seems to me that what's going on here is that people forget that a place has as many different names as there are languages that talk about it. So, I mean, one to quote here would be somewhere like, say...
Well, Germany could...
Germany.
Yeah.
Germany is Deutschland.
Mm-hmm.
In English it's Germany. And in French it's Allemagne. These three word forms are not related to each other at all, any more than New Zealand and Aotearoa are related to each other. But they are simply the designations in three languages for their country. And examples of this are all over the country. Russia is Russia in Russian. In Finnish, however, it's Venäjä. And Ruotsi is their word for Sweden. Funnily enough. So
Which sounds a bit like Russia. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. In fact, it is their form of the word for Russia, but it's applied to Sweden.
Right.
In the same way as we say Dutch, which is our version of Deutsch, but we apply to the people who live in Holland.
Yeah.
There are as many names for places as there are languages that you talk about it in. So to that extent, it seems to me that people who really would like to have Aotearoa as an English name for this country are sort of showing to me that they think that what happens in English is really what's important. Whereas it seems to me, if they're interested in Māori language, it's what's happening in Māori, it's what's happening in Māori or what's happening with Māori that should be important. What drew this mostly to my attention was that I've lived in both Switzerland and Germany. Switzerland has 4 languages. Each of these languages has its own form of the word that we call Switzerland. Nobody would dream of insisting that any one of these should be imported into any one of the others.
Right.
It just would not occur to them.
Yes.
And the same applies to names of towns.
Yes.
And so on. So, you know, having become used to this idea when having lived there, you know, I thought, what's going on in here? And it seemed to me, and this I tried to back this up in this paper with other examples, that people have an implicit attitude that what is important is what happens in English.
Yes.
And, changing the word slightly, what's important happens in English.
Yes.
And this seems to me, if that's there, then I wonder what they really want for Māori. Because what I would like to see for Māori is it's important what happens in Māori. What's important should happen in Māori just as much as in English. For it to be a full language. You know.
Yes, and I got a quote here. I pulled out a quote from that paper. Quote, "I find it striking that these measures serve to increase the visibility and distinctiveness of Māori as an element within an English-speaking environment, not as a language in its own right."
Yeah, and there's actually no harm in this at all, and I think that's what we're seeing at the moment. And I hope it's not just Māori Language Week, but the way Māori is now being used in broadcast media, for instance.
As an import.
As an import, yeah. You know, I think this enhances the visibility of the Māori, and it's quite nice to see, I think, too, that I think this is the case, that the acceptance of this is perhaps much higher as time goes on than it has been in the past. I think this is all good. And if people are happy with that, if that's all people actually secretly want, fine. You know?
Yeah.
It's just, it's not then a whole language, that's the only thing. And I'm sure a lot of people would not really, in their heart of hearts, be satisfied with that, because a language is a carrier of so many things, particularly, you know, proverbs, songs, stories, identity, expression of oneself and so on, that for a language to be, in fact, in the end, limited to just inserts in a foreign language is a bit of a shame.
Yeah.
In fact, it was a great shame.
I want to shift tack slightly, but it's sort of on a similar note. This idea of changes coming from the top down. So you've been involved with Te Taurewhiri, which has been involved with producing a whole lot of words for things which there weren't necessarily words for, or there were old words which fell out of fashion, or for whatever reason. And as you mentioned, there's some people who find that they don't understand it, or some of them don't like it, and that's their prerogative. And you're also a linguist, which strikes me as interesting because your job, or your creed, if you have one, and you could disagree with this maybe, but is one of descriptivism. You know, your job was to describe the language, not to prescribe. Is there any sort of tension inside?
Right, I've got another cartoon from this book, One Stone, Two Birds, by Yin Now, founder of Bro and Bro. Bro, my roommate thinks I'm schizophrenic. Don't worry, bro, you don't have a roommate. I think it's my favourite one, actually. Every
linguistics class I've taught to, certainly the beginners ones, I've said, I actually wear 2 hats, so to say. One hat is that of a linguist, and a linguist's job is to describe and account for language and how people use it. So the people are the ones who are getting it right. It's up to the linguist to take account of that. That's one of my hats. The other hat is that I'm actually very much of a pedant at the same time. And so I sometimes find this difficult to keep these two apart.
Yes.
When it comes, though, to the example you mentioned, a top-down development of a language, and the Commission certainly went in for this in a big way right from the start, and as far as I know they're still doing it. This is the developing of vocabulary and the promulgating of terminologies and so on.
Mm-hmm.
It has to be said here that English is an immensely powerful language in this world. It's got a huge vocabulary, and many other languages, even such well-established languages as the European ones, actually consciously have institutions which exist purely in a way to keep up with English in this area of terminology.
Right.
So the notion of having some kind of authority which sets vocabulary is by no means unique. Certainly, all the minority languages that I've ever had much to do with, and these include not only the Swiss one, Romansh, but also Galician in Spain, and to some degree Welsh, that I've spent some time with them as well. They all do this as well. And the goal is, if you like, to catch up with English. Or to put it more nicely, to provide vocabulary so that the languages can be used in ways that they either have not been used in for a very long time, and I'll come back to that, or that they haven't ever been used in. So this applies particularly to the legal sphere and to education. So a lot of the work done by the Commission has been developing vocabularies for the Māori curriculum in schools. So some science terminology, maths terminology, and so on. And you can make the case that in the instance of things like education and legal system and health and important terminologies of that sort, having one set and not having a different set for every region has certain advantages in the preparation of resources, in complete lack of ambiguity and so on. And somebody has to drive this. And so it's been largely the Commission that's done this.
Can I ask you about the word hākinakina?
Oh yeah, I wondered if you'd do that. It wasn't just hākinakina, but one of the ways the Commission would work, we had some principles in doing these new words. One was never borrow from English for these, because we suspected that while Māori has borrowed a lot of English words over the last couple of centuries, these would not go down well. There's a real puristic streak in the modern Māori effort. So that was one. So we had to therefore use resources which already existed in Māori, and this can include things like paraphrase, where you'd use a phrase which was descriptive of some event. So the term which devised for the accused in the court was te tangata e whakapaitiana, the person who is being accused. And so occasionally a phrase would come like that. Or you take existing words and you use some of the morphological possibilities of Māori, which include things like duplication or adding prefixes and that sort of thing. So the word for, let's say, music. Māori had terms for different genres of music, had terms for different musical instruments, what we'd call musical instruments, but there doesn't seem to have been a cover term corresponding to the more general term of English music. So puoro was coined based on oro, which is a sound. Puoro was coined by means of prefix, and that's now that word.
Where does the pu come from?
Well, pu is quite a common prefix for all sorts of things. Both historically and recently as well. Just going sideways a bit here, when Polynesians came here from tropical Polynesia, they encountered all sorts of new plants and other things, but they brought with them words from their homeland. And one of these words they brought down was whara, which is cognate with pandanus and means pandanus in the tropics. So they came down here with this word and they applied it to local plants that they thought were similar. And one of these is pūwharawhara, which is generated from whara by means of this additional, if you like, specifying prefix plus reduplication. So a lot of that went on. A great deal went on in coining words for the local flora. So that's that sort of process. Now, what we would also do was scour the dictionaries, particularly Williams, but other sources like that, for words which had fallen out of use, which could be specialised again. And you'll find a lot of modern Māori words are historically different types of kete. Okay, so there's putea, was a type of basket, but now it's used for the basket holding resources, so money, a fund,
Right.
a budget. Okay, pūkoro is another one, which is a long, rather narrow basket, I understand, is now used for pocket.
Yes.
And also for
And,
pūkoro ure.
Yeah, other kinds of pockets.
A condom. So we were scouring the dictionary, and sport came up.
Yes.
We wanted to work for sport. Now again, Māori had games. Māori had words either coined or borrowed for the games that people play. So futuporo, for instance, tenehi, okay, were some of the borrowed words, and then there were coined words as well. But no overall word for sport, except perhaps kemu, which is games. But somebody wanted sport.
Yes.
So we looked in the dictionary. We came across this word hākinakina, which is glossed as sport in the dictionary. Now, the dictionary provides one reference for this occurrence of this dictionary. It may occur elsewhere.
Yes.
I don't want to say it hasn't occurred elsewhere, but the one reference in here was a South Island text. It occurs in the story of Rona. Now, in the North Island, the story of Rona involves Rona being a woman. This one, however, the South Island one, Rona is a man, he's a fisherman. And he goes out to sea to fish. And while he's away, some tipua, some kind of if you like, divine being, comes down, flattens the fences around the house, and then we are told, hākinakina, with Rona's wife. And this is translated as this person, this entity, comes and sports with his wife. So it goes in the dictionary as sport. But never mind, now hākinakina is the word for sport. Fine, absolutely fine. Doesn't matter where it comes from. I mean, it could be possible to find equally odd etymologies in English. I mean, one that springs to mind is our word silly, but it's cognate with the German word selig, which means blessed. And a lot of pairs like that between German and English can be made. So a knecht is a servant in German, but a knight is a knight in English.
Right.
The different tracks which words follow in their languages.
According to their contexts.
Yeah, and their meanings just shift. Yeah, I mean, one I quite like to quote is that there's the word wiki in Māori means now week, obviously borrowed from week. But you find there are early texts where you talk about somebody arriving in a village. Ka wiki mātou ki reira. And that means we spent the Sunday there. And other words shift a lot. So a tāriana now in Māori is a boar. Not only a stallion, but a boar as well. So once a word has entered a language, whether it's borrowed or coined or whatever, it will take its own course, and it won't slavishly follow the history of the word that it comes from in some other source language.
I want to finish by asking a couple of quick-fire questions. If you were to write another book on Te Reo Māori, what would you think it would be about? In other words, what areas of research from a linguistic point of view are potentially unexplored or...
Well, the dialect one.
Yeah.
It would probably be dialect. Another area which would have been quite interesting to follow is where is the history. See if it can be found even. The history of certain words which Māori has, all dialects of Māori have, but which don't occur in the closely related languages like Cook Islands Māori or Tahitian. A particularly prominent one here is the word mōhio, to know. I know of no cognate for that outside Māori.
Hmm.
There may be one, I just don't know yet, but that's one. So, but if I was still in the book writing mood, I wouldn't write either of those books. I would write a book on Māori traditional prose literature. It just seems to me that there's actually lying around, even in published books, but particularly also in library collections, mountains of 19th century Māori text, which is just simply ignored. And it may be being ignored because people are simply not aware of it or the extent of it.
What kinds of texts? Because I'm aware of newspapers from that time, but I'm not actually aware of.
There's all the newspapers and lots of good stuff in them.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking here, the genres I'm thinking of, first of all, there's whakapapa. And whakapapa is not just lists of names. You know, it's histories of family and that sort of thing. There's also the wide range of different creation stories. I mean, the one that everybody knows is the one which Gray published in Ngā Mahi a Ngā Tūpuna.
Right.
But there are other ones. There's a great one from the South Island. And there are others from, in fact, all over the north, you know, which are preserved in manuscript. Some of them actually typed up in typescript form. There are tribal histories. There's a great book by Peter Nui Jones on Tainui. I don't know how far people read that seriously as part of their study. They're just stories. Yeah. Just yarns.
What's your advice we talked about language learning, but what's your advice for someone who wants to learn a language?
I can only tell you what works for me.
Yeah.
What has worked for me is just getting the hang of the grammar, and then just trying it out by myself. And then the hardest skill for me has been, I guess, actually speaking. Of the four, there's reading, writing, speaking, and listening. In the order, reading, writing, listening, and speaking, I think, are the increasing degrees of difficulty.
Right.
I've written novels in all sorts of odd languages, which I do just with a dictionary in my hand. Couldn't dream of writing in those languages, though. However, there are languages in which I can write relatively well, where my speaking is not great. And then the languages which I can hear fluently, and then these days being that bit deaf, even that doesn't work much anymore, are really only German and Māori. But as I said before, I think it's important for people, especially adults, just to somehow get a hang of the grammar.
Yeah.
And Duolingo is quite good in this regard. It does no explicit grammatical teaching, but they've structured the way it works that you see patterns of how endings are used or whatever the different, or the word order and so on. It's just forced on you over and over and over again.
Yeah.
Then trying to read stuff would be next for me.
Yeah.
Most languages, it's easy to get, or can be got, quite simple materials. And then if you get the chance to hear, and in New Zealand, unfortunately, even hearing Māori is a bit restricted. When I first came back from Germany and was still very much learning the language, I used to record te karere every night. And I would play it as often as was necessary until I had actually understood it completely. And this could be many, many times. But as time goes on, you get better at that, it seems to me. And in the case of speaking, it's having a go. Yeah.
And you'll fall flat on your face. But, yeah.
People, in my experience, people are amazingly generous and hospitable.
Yes.
When it comes to trying their language.
Yes.
The Parisians are legendary in being not like that. But in my experience, all other French are good.
Right.
And again, in my experience, Māori speakers with whom I've tried to converse have always been really generous.
Yes. Yeah, I've found
hospitable about that.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Ray, for sitting down and chatting with me today. It's been a lot of fun.
I hope that serves your purpose.
Yeah. No, thanks very much.